Good morning, campers! Hey guys, it's Zach, and before we start this episode, this is our Patreon exclusive episode on the book Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. I have to give a disclaimer for this episode. This book contains a lot of adult themes, and a lot of things that we're going to be talking about are very adult and not really as much young adult as we're used to for Percy Jackson, so I want to give everyone a warning for people that might not want to listen to this book. For us, we talk about it, we go into detail, we talk about the characters, we talk about the plot, we talk about what we think about, and we get super nerdy about pop culture references, but we just wanted to give you guys a warning for anyone that doesn't want to listen to it. That's okay. This was made for our Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much. This episode is supported by you guys. We're going to be having more content coming in the future, but thank you guys, and I hope you guys enjoyed this episode because it was rad-a-cool. I'm going to ollie out of here. See ya!
Good evening, campers. Welcome to Radio Camp Half-Blood. This is not going to be a Percy Jackson podcast. We are doing one of our bonus episodes on the book Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. I'm Zach.
I'm B. And we're going to be talking a lot about pop culture in this episode. Finally an excuse to talk about pop culture.
B, didn't you know what a podcast is? I mean, there was this one podcast I used to listen to called My Brother and Me. It's this old podcast. You know how it is.
You've probably never heard of it. It's really niche, and it's not like the most popular podcast in the world.
And then there was this other
Right now.
podcast back in like the 2000s, 2010s called Welcome to Night Vale. Another niche podcast. No one's going to know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm so weird I listen to NPR. Anyway, I actually don't.
Oh, I love
It's
NPR.
boring.
Oh, what are you talking about? Like, This American Life and The Moth is amazing. Okay, we're going to get, like, derailed. Ah,
Yeah,
man.
we're getting derailed already.
Well, I mean, half of this book gets derailed with pop culture references.
That's true. We're out Ernest Clining Ernest Cline.
Oh, my God. So, B, what did you think of this book? Because I gave you this book for Christmas thinking that you would love it.
You did. It was my Christmas gift. It was because I love getting a homework assignment for Christmas.
Well, B, didn't you know that's what we do? Instead of, like, Jewish guilt, we Jewish guilt you.
Yeah, that's true. I was like, oh yeah, you're used to Hanukkah, so your concept of gifts is like, I'm gonna give you a book and you have to read it within this span of time. Anyway, I like the book. I don't know. I have like mixed feelings about it in some ways. You and I watched the movie together a few months ago when you visited, and that was like fun in like a like slapdash blockbuster kind of way, and I think it doesn't quite work the same way when you're reading it because it's not just like dumb popcorn entertainment when you're reading it, and I think in some ways it comes across as a little bit more clunky with all of the cultural references. I found a list the other day, but now I can't seem to find it, of all of the different like references that they make, and it's probably not even exhaustive. It's, I mean, truly impossible for me to list them all here. It would just be a whole episode of us just talking about the different video games and cultural things. Like, yeah, and some of these things I didn't know also because I'm not as well versed in certain like 80s pop culture. Like I know about teen movies, I would say, so like all of like the John Hughes stuff I understood.
You mean the Brat Pack?
Yeah, like all that stuff I understood. I like got the references to a couple like video games, and then obviously I remembered some things from the movie. The movie's not the same, but it's the same general idea. I wouldn't say this is my favorite book, but it was interesting. I think it speaks to an interesting part of our current culture, how we consume media, how we define ourselves through media, how we use media to distract ourselves maybe from the way the world is.
Yeah, like for me, the reason why I read this book the first time was people kept telling me I talked how Ernest Cline writes.
Yeah.
Like, okay, finally, I'm just going to sit down, read this book, and I really enjoyed it for the first, like, when I first read it, I was so shocked. It was like almost being like punch drunk. Almost, it was just like, oh my God. And the more you read it, the more things you appreciate.
Well, because it's literally you, and it definitely... well, not literally you, but it's sort of... It makes sense why you would like this book, because I think about when we record regular Radio Camp Half-Blood episodes and how like literally the one we just recorded, you're just like, hey, it's like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, or it's like that's your cultural language that you speak is like in references. And I feel that way too. It's just sometimes our references are different. It's just the type of person you are. Like you tend to reference more like B movie stuff or like action movie things. Well, I tend to reference like, I don't know, 70s sitcoms like that. Those are kind of the differences between us.
For me, when I read this book, for me, it hits on a different, like, chord in my soul, almost. Like, I'm going to be very poetic about this and how, like, for me, much like Wade Watts, I grew up, like, in an age, 2008 to about 2014. Everything I did involved playing Xbox Live and video games and just my friends. I never had real-life friends. I had, like, people on the internet who I had spent so much time with. Like, for me, it's weird. Like, the ending of this book made me so emotional. Like, the very last sentence of this book, because I've had that experience before. You can look at this book very surface level and get the references, but if you are, like, a gamer and, like, you've delved into, like, the way of thinking and, like, some of these ideas about the Oasis, this book kind of can speak differently.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're kind of in this weird meta loop right now, talking about it on a show where you're a friend of mine that I met online, and we're talking about friends who met online, and like in some ways the podcast isn't like a real place. It's like this, you know, virtual world that we create in our minds. So it's, yeah, I mean, it's not like literally like the Oasis. It's not, you know, a fully immersive virtual reality thing, but I would be hypocritical if I were to be super judgmental of the people in this book because I'm not that different from them, but there are certain unhealthy things that they take it too far, and it makes me a little concerned sometimes about humankind's nature to find, I guess, distractions from problems. And
yes, and we'll talk about it. We'll get into it very soon. I was just thinking that when I gave it this book, I was like rereading it, and then I forgot about a specific part in the book, and I'm like, oh no, I forgot about this. I think there's a reason why I blocked this out of my mind. B, are you okay?
oh, are you talking about the sex robot?
Yes, talking about the sex robot. I was just like, oh, this is really awkward. Even to read is awkward. I'm sure Ernest Cline was like, this is awkward to write.
Yeah, actually that didn't so much like shock me in some ways just because of like the world that he created. Like it's pretty clear that that's the kind of person that would do that, I guess. I don't know. It's because you're in this world where no one ever experiences anything in reality. And then it reminded me a lot of, I talked about this a couple times in reference to this book. I read the book Feed for my children's literature class like a long time ago in undergrad. And it's not exactly the same, but it's sort of like this similar idea where people are plugged into this network that helps them escape reality. And there's this scene where it's not a sex scene. It's just the main character whose name I can't remember from that book. He's like just ordering a bunch of pants online, and he's just like, it's a very like dramatic moment where he's upset and he just is like getting the satisfaction of like consuming something. And I think that that's like very reminiscent of, I guess, the characters in this book, particularly Parzival. He's really into just the feedback of the world of the Oasis. Like it's like an addiction to him.
Yes, I think the way we're going to break down this review is going to be a little different than how we normally would talk about it by chapter, because that would take like 6 hours and I'd have to like explain like every reference.
There's also so many references. Like if we don't mention your favorite reference, like I don't even remember all the references. I probably didn't pick up on a lot of references too because I'm not super well versed in like video game culture really, or even like necessarily nerd culture. I'm aware of D&D, but I've played it only a couple times, like that kind of thing.
So the way that we're going to break down this review is going to be, we're going to talk about the characters, we'll talk about the plot, and then we're going to kind of talk about the impact and kind of like what is the true meaning of the story, because I feel like if we do it that way, it benefits rather than just be like, well, then this happened. Well, then Parzival got this key, and then, you know, he's really sad, and then he got this key.
I find it funny that we're both calling him Parzival, right? Like, that's what you start to think of him as, even though that's literally not his real name. And it's like he's not going by that name.
Not to, like, float my ego, but, like, I could, like, talk about this with some authority.
Yeah, I think you can.
Like, your username is your name. Like, I will talk about when it comes to online stuff, I can talk about it because, low key, if I read this book when I was 16, I would have been like, Wade Watts is my hero. But now it's just like, oh, I'm so sorry for you, Wade.
Dangerous implications of that.
Yes, but so let me read the back of the book first to get into the mood, and then we'll get into it. In the year 2044, reality is an ugly place. The only time teenager Wade Watts really feels alive is when he's jacked into the virtual utopia known as the Oasis. Wade develops his life to studying the puzzles hidden within the world's digital confines, puzzles that are based on the creator's obsession with the pop culture of the decade past, and that promises massive power, fortune to whoever can unlock them. But when Wade stumbles upon the first clue, he finds himself beset by players willing to kill to take the ultimate prize. The race is on, and if Wade's going to survive, he'll have to win and confront the real world, as he always been desperate to escape. So what we'll do first, we're going to talk about all the characters. So B, what did you think of all the characters as a whole?
It's interesting to see like the different relationships that people have to the Oasis and how they get what they want. I think probably the most relatable that I found was Artemis, because I think she was a little bit more like altruistic with her perspective on like the power that you could have if you had control of the Oasis. I think Wade is actually kind of a irksome is maybe the word I'd look for character. He kind of has some character development in that he realizes how kind of sick it is that he's so obsessed with the Oasis, and on the outside he's like very unhealthy just in every possible way that you could describe unhealthy. I mean, they're interesting characters, and I do think that I would be a hypocrite if I were to judge everything about Wade, because I understand that if the world was that terrible, I can't speak for certain that I would be like, oh yeah, of course I would go out and try to fix things, or maybe I would just be like escapist, like in my little pod trying to, I don't know, like I can't say what I would do in his situation, and that's kind of what everyone is doing anyway. Like that's the general culture of people, is they, even like rich people have really expensive like haptic suits and like little I forget like the phrase for the like the machines that they use to hook up.
They have like omnidirectional treadmills.
Yeah, like exactly. They're just like in these completely immersive things. Like especially the rich people have like especially immersive experiences of the Oasis because they have all this money and they could feel like they're literally in reality.
And they can also smell too. Like there's like a big point about like there's like
all
smells.
your senses are affected by these suits. So like if you're, the more technology you have, the more you could feel like fully in the Oasis, which is kind of horrifying and interesting that like even someone like say the head of IOI, Nolan Sorrento, like he uses his haptic suit and everything pretty often, and he has all this money, so you think, oh, maybe he could like actually live in the real world and experience the real world. He's not just some like teenage kid who lives in a trailer park, essentially like a sci-fi horrifying version of a trailer park, but he still spends most of his time in virtual reality.
So for me, when it comes to the story, the first time you read it, it's like, oh, the story's all about Wade. Not really. The more I read it, the more I understand this works more as almost like a D&D session where it works as an ensemble piece rather than just Wade Watts, self-pity man that he is. And that it works as like the most important thing about like Wade is that he becomes less introverted and more extroverted as the story goes on, and he needs actually the help of his friends. Like he's willing to like forego the whole competition to help his friends.
Well, I mean the whole Schoolhouse Rock thing with
3
like,
is a magic number.
Have to work together. Yeah, 3 is a magic number.
And the great thing about it is that when it comes to each character has like something that's so interesting about them. Like you could have a story easily about Artemis, or you can have a story easily about H or Shoto and Daito. You have like all these wonderful, like interesting characters. And my favorite thing about this though is like I'm so used to just reading books. It was like, oh, the villain, like, oh, I want to hear his side of the backstory. Like, what does he do? Really, Nolan Sorrento is just like a 1980s like evil bad guy businessman villain.
Yeah, he's pretty one-dimensional as a villain, I guess. He just wants to control. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that he's like an 80s villain because it is like an 80s pastiche in a sci-fi setting, which is weird because you're constantly referring to 80s pop culture, but the setting is like super post-apocalyptic sci-fi.
I would call it tech noir if we're doing like Blade Runner almost, where it's just like...
Yeah, that's true. There's that. It has like some cyberpunk elements to it, I would say, because there's a lot of like body hacking stuff going on where people aren't experiencing reality in a normal way.
Yes, and it's almost refreshing to have a villain that's just like, I'm evil for the sake of being evil, rather
Yeah,
than...
he's evil out of greed, I guess, is because he just wants to have the Oasis cost money and to put ads in it, and that's like his motivation, which is a motivation, and there are people like that, and it might be interesting to know how he got there, I guess, like why he became that villain.
So if I'm remembering this correctly, there actually is a short story that was like a fan fiction that another author wrote. I can't remember the name of the author, but it was like someone super famous, and that Ernest Cline's like, yeah, that's his backstory.
So there is. That's really fun. I would like to read that because I think in some ways it makes sense that he's like, I'm just evil and greedy. Like, that's such like a, I don't know, 1980s like Captain Planet type of villain where I'm like, I just want to cause pollution and money and I love business. Like, that's just his character.
One of my favorite things is like when you watch movies from the 90s where it's about like environmentalism, is like always the villain is a guy that drives like a big ass car.
Yeah.
Like he wears like a starched like white suit and a cowboy hat, and he just has like rattlesnake boots.
Like Doug Dimmadome.
Yeah, it looks like Doug Dimmadome. It's almost refreshing to have a character like that, because we're in this weird trend now, like in fantasy and like in a lot of books where it's just like, well, there's no one's truly evil because we want to have everyone like gray level characters that are just like neutral rather than just like, man, it's like good versus evil.
That's very unfortunate events as a character. Like, oh, let's look at the backstory of why people are the way they are. But this, again, it harkens back to a specific type of villain, and I think that's maybe intentional, so I'm not super judgmental that we don't get into, like, why does Nolan Sorrento care so much? I mean, there are people like that. There are greedy people who would want to own a very powerful resource like the Oasis, which literally everyone uses for everything. They use it for e-commerce. They use it to go to school. Like, literally the school system is in the Oasis.
Especially real world money is worthless. You need Oasis credits.
Yeah, you need Oasis credits so you can do things virtually, because no one wants to exist in the real world because it's like overpopulation and pollution, and everyone's living in like these horrible sort of like shanty towns, and it's kind of a horrible situation, and like the reality of it. And I get that, and that's why I'm not super harsh about even someone like Wade, who is very detached from reality in a lot of ways, because I would want to be detached from reality because it's not a great place to be.
Well, especially the idea of how tempting the Oasis is, and we'll get to the main creator, James Halliday, and how he just wanted to make a cool video game, and it just got so out of hand, where he's just like, you know what, finally, because I'm who I am, I like the idea of virtual reality because I don't have to deal with real people, because, you know, I'm not really wired to deal with real people, and it's like almost like even the creator has become like trapped in his own reality. It's like, you know what, I'm about to die. I love the idea of like the world because I'm missing out, and I'm going to make this contest to make people really see like you need to be in reality rather than just like living in this video game that I've created because it's just a beast all in itself.
Though it's kind of like this contradictory thing because you do have to know a lot about pop culture in order to win the contest. But then, like, the lesson at the end is like, hey, the only way you can experience happiness is in the real world. So it's like, oh, great, thanks for wasting my time.
So it's a little different because when I'm looking at this from James Halliday's point of view, it's like, one, he has Asperger's, and the things that he likes is what he wants other people to like, which, you know, for me, it's almost the same thing. It's like, hey, I like the Name of the Wind. B, I really, 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 really want you to read the Name of the Wind.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's like the idea of a special interest. So, like, the special interest that James Halliday has is 80s pop culture, I guess, specifically. Like, there's some other stuff thrown in there sometimes, but it's mainly that. Like, he references, there's other references to, like, older things and different books from, like, time periods that aren't just the 80s, but that's like the main thing.
Yes, and then the other thing I'm trying to get across as well is there's a specific reason why it's the 80s, and that is, and to most extent, it's a simpler time. Like, this is before, like, you know, the internet or like really pop culture as like it has exploded as it is today, and it's like the idea of it's like harkening back to like a simpler time as we see with like when you go to his old town in Middletown. It's just like, oh yeah, things used to not be really shitty. So it's like the idea of it's almost like a wake-up call. Like, you know, not saying like you should live in the 80s, but it's like, oh, you should like strive to like what it was like in the 80s, where it's like people would go on their bikes, go to the arcade, grab like some pizza, and just be people rather than just stay inside and be like introverts on the internet. So let's go into each character individually because I find they're all really interesting in their own unique aspects. So B, what did you think of, I guess, Parzival / Wade Watts?
I have mixed feelings about him. I feel like he could have had a little bit more character growth. I guess at the end he does decide that he doesn't really want to be in the Oasis anymore. Like he likes reality, and that's a lesson that he learned. Or he doesn't like reality, but he wants to be in reality. But at the same time, his like treatment of Artemis is kind of like socially arrested. Like he kind of is creepy to her, and then he says like I love you, and she doesn't say it back at the end, and that's kind of awkward for everyone. And I don't know, I think he like fetishizes her like avatar and her whole persona based on like what he sees online, and then they meet in person, he's like immediately obsessed with her. Like yeah, I don't feel super comfortable with that aspect of him because I'm getting like some vague friend zone type of dangerous person who exists on the internet, like a guy who feels like entitled to people, and like that makes me kind of uncomfortable about him. I really in some ways want a sequel to this because I want to see like where that goes. Like
Ready Player 2.
Yeah, they're writing a sequel, right? Yeah, I know. I heard that they were writing a sequel. I googled that right after I finished this book because I'm like, wait, okay, this in some ways nothing happened in this story other than we just learned how dangerous the Oasis could be. And I guess Wade has like finally an inkling that it could be dangerous to do that. But the world is still terrible. Like they didn't accomplish anything outside of a virtual reality world. They just got some keys to open a door to have a dude be like, yeah, so reality's important. Like it's kind of this self-defeating thing where they did all this stuff in the Oasis to learn that the Oasis isn't as important as the real world.
Also, when it comes to Parzival, when I'm looking at this as, you know, each I guess arc is like a level because it's each gate, is that the first level, he is the most unlikable person you could possibly have in a book. Like
he's pretty gross.
He's pretty gross.
Yeah.
Like I hate him. But like the second he starts to get money and he realizes is, you know, this is more than just a game and I kind of need to be nice to people, because his last like FU literally got his aunt killed.
Yeah, literally. He was just like, he's like, try me at IOI because they say that if he doesn't give them the hint to the key, then
he's bluffing.
Yeah, he thinks he's just like, yeah, exactly, like trolling someone on Xbox Live, basically. Like that's like his headspace is this doesn't matter, because that's the weird thing about the Oasis is it's simultaneously reality to a lot of people, but they don't really.
But it's also anonymity.
Yeah, it's anonymity, and they don't think about like the consequences, like the internet, really. But like it's the internet taken to the extreme of like you can literally do anything, but you could have real world consequences in that. So he's like, oh yeah, well I'm not going to tell you, blah blah blah, and then like literally his trailer park blows up, and he has to be like, oh, oops.
When it comes to the first part of this book, I mean, it's very much like quintessential like edgy teen book. Oh yeah, my parents are dead, and I live with like my abusive aunt and her abusive like stepdad.
Oh yeah, and it's like sad Harry Potter. We talk about Harry Potter a lot, but it is very much Harry Potter. He's living with an aunt. Like it's worse. It's worse than Harry Potter. Definitely is.
Well, because at least with like Harry Potter, like they fed them. Like in this book series, Aunt Alice like steals his food stamps.
She steals things from him to like pay for drugs. Yeah, like it's not great. It's a pretty horrifying scenario. I do give credit to Ernest Cline for having a very interesting setting. I think the stacks as a setting is like very evocative. These trailers held together by these poorly constructed sort of rails that hold them up. Like that's a good sci-fi setting, I think. They're running out of space on Earth, right?
It makes sense because, you know, in most like Asian countries, when they make a mall, it isn't like flat. They build up. Like there's like 10-story malls.
Well, because of like overpopulation, which makes sense. Like that's what's happening in America because they've run
out. And the
more
interesting thing about it is like, well, we have all these cars that don't have gas. We might as well just dump them and we'll just like stack them up and make like mobile house parks. And what I love about the stacks as well is it's the perfect setting for, it's like, of course I want to be in the Oasis. I don't blame Wade Watts for like wanting to like live in the Oasis.
A 3-dimensional trailer park where it goes upward. Like that sounds like the worst place to live.
And not only that, but like Wade Watts doesn't even live on the ground level. Like he literally lives on the tippity top.
He lives like at the top. Yeah.
It's like, oh my God.
Horrifying.
He even says like, God is dead. God doesn't exist. Everything sucks except the Oasis.
Oh, there's that also aspect of religion because we meet Mrs. Gilmore, who she's an interesting character that you meet for like 5 seconds and then she dies. I kind of wish that we heard more from her because she's kind of an interesting concept, like this woman who was alive in the 80s, so she knows all of this pop culture firsthand. Do you know what my headcanon is?
Who?
That she's Lorelai Gilmore. Because she's the right age. Right? Because isn't Lorelai is in her teens in the 80s, and she's obsessed with pop culture. That actually kind of makes sense as a headcanon. Has this been written? Has this fanfic been written? Was the name Gilmore intentional? Because the only person I can compare Ernest Cline to is actually Amy Sherman Palladino, because she's obsessed with cultural references, obsessed with it. Like, have you ever watched one of her shows? Like, Gilmore Girls and Marvelous Mrs. Maisel are packed to the gills with pop culture references. They're different kinds of pop culture references. They're not the same type of culture. They're farther away from nerd culture and closer to, like, other types of references. But still, really similar.
That might be a thing, because, Ernest Cline puts in things that he likes, because some of the stuff he puts in, like, okay, but it's like you think about, in context, when he was a kid, he must have like really liked these things, but like in the first part of the book, like Wade Watts, again, like he's like, God is dead, everything's terrible, I should just like off myself.
Oh yeah, the God is dead thing, I mentioned Mrs. Gilmore because she's like a part of a weird online mega church. That's why we know about that, because he's like, can you imagine believing in something that isn't real? Anyway, I'm gonna get into my VR headset. Like, he doesn't even realize how like ridiculous that is. Well, he actually does say that he basically sees that as his religion, right?
Yeah, well, he says that, and he pretty much is like, he's almost like if he didn't have the Oasis, he would have just killed himself a long time ago. But the idea that it's not just the Oasis, but the idea of like the Easter egg hunt and James Halliday's like, I have an actual reason to live, and because of it, it's like the idea of it's like the rags to riches story, which is very popular. This entire book is pretty much the hero's journey. Like, if I described every aspect of the hero's journey, everything falls into place here. But it's like the idea of once he gets money, he starts to become a much better person. Like, I love Wade for being the fact of just, like, he believes in something, but also it's like, I have my friends. But then halfway through, it's like, I kind of fall in love with Artemis, and, like, yes, it is kind of creepy. Especially like the beginning parts where like she's kind of like playing him on a little bit, and it's just like, don't do that, please don't. So yeah, like he hits rock bottom when like Artemis dumps him, and like this is where it's like you kind of start to pity him a little bit. It's like, oh man, like he really needs like a little bit of like a win, or like he's never gonna come out of this alive. And
at the same time, I think it's fair that Artemis dumps him.
I totally agree with Artemis for like dumping him. When you like read the parts where like he's just like being like in self-pity, where he's literally like removed all of his hair,
yeah, including his eyebrows, so that way he can feel the haptic suit better, which again, totally nutso butso to do that. Like, he just looks like a weird naked mole rat and puts on his weird suit. Well, because he like is also getting too heavy for his suit, and so then he like starts this crazy exercise regime. So he gets ripped and then also has no hair. It's like a very weird image.
But okay, so this is the sad thing is I kind of wish that technology existed where you had to like actually like work out to like physically do like get on the internet
to get power.
And stuff. Like,
yeah,
that's like a technology I wish I had, because I give people excuse to like work out a little bit.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting because you think, oh, well, at least he's healthier now, but not really, because he's...
Oh, no, he's like less healthy now.
He's ripped, but he's only ripped so he can play video games better, which is not healthy.
Yeah, no, like he literally has to like drink like a sludge because he's getting like light deprivation because he doesn't go outside.
Yeah, it's like Soylent.
It's so great.
And he has like a new identity too, Bryce Lynch.
Oh, yes, Bryce Lynch.
Which is very Irish sounding.
But as we see here, he kind of like becomes a better person because once he's hit rock bottom, the only way he can go is up. And he does that. He gets to the point where it's like, oh my God, like the Sixers are going to like win this competition. I'm going to give my friends all the information I know because I actually got like a head up after he sees Artemis get up ahead. And he's like, you know what? I'm willing to like let this competition go to the wayside to help my friends so the Sixers don't get this.
Well, I guess not the competition go to the wayside, but like not just focus on him winning the competition and instead work together. That's sort of the lesson I think that you were getting at when we first started talking. Like, yeah, it is like a D&D campaign. Like they have to work together to achieve certain goals. Like it's literally impossible at a certain point if you don't have the three people.
Yes, and the one thing I noticed when you're reading this book about Wade is that all of the major events that are happening aren't in the Oasis, but when he's in the real life and doing all of his things. Like, we're like, oh yeah, so internet companies can like make you indentured servants if you don't pay your bills.
Oh yeah, that's so creepy. That's that whole thing of like if you don't pay your bills, I guess, then because he obviously has money because of like the weird sponsorships he gets from being the first person to get a key, but he intentionally gets put into indentured servitude so that way he could sneak into IOI and like hack them. It's very weird.
The weird thing about it though is that we're almost there where that might actually be a thing. That's the scary part.
Yeah, no, that's like maybe the scariest part of this book. Like you think, oh, this is a fun romp. This is a tragedy, this book. This is looking up to a mirror and being like, I really hope that this isn't us in whenever this takes place, 2050, 2060, whatever.
2044.
2040, 2044. That's pretty soon. 2044 isn't even that far away.
But, he does the thing. It's like he hacks into the system, which is the only part of the book that I hated because there's no stakes whatsoever because Wade's plans go without a hitch. There's no snag in the plan like an Ocean's 11 movie where it's like, oh, the plan that we made that we've been formulating, something goes wrong and we have to improvise.
No, it always works out perfectly because he's such an expert at all of these pop culture things, and so it comes super easy to him.
He's almost like a Gary Stu.
Gary Stu. That's really good. I've never heard that. That's fun. That's very funny. He is kind of, yeah, he's like an expert. But that's the thing is this is the only place where he is an expert. He's like a loser and a weirdo in real life. So he's an expert at 80s pop culture and everything about James Halliday and about being in the Oasis and winning games. Like that's his wheelhouse.
I think of like, what is it? The boy band in Gravity Falls. Like they don't know how to drink out of a glass of water.
Yeah.
It's like if you put Parzival like in that situation, like he would be the exact same way.
Yeah, well, when you say Parzival, it's like, are you talking about Wade or are you talking about Parzival? Like, because there's difference between those.
When it comes to like online games, like what your username is like
your identity. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the idea of like giving someone like your actual name is like the most intimate thing you can give to an online gamer.
Well, it's also incredibly important that he conceals his identity because of people like IOI who want to kill him and his friends, and so he's trying to like hide his identity, and then he changes his real name anyway for a little bit of time.
Yes, and he does that, and the most important thing about that is that when it comes to like usernames and stuff, like when it came to me, like mine was Suda, and people still call me that. Like, people don't even know my real name. Like there's still people that I still talk to on a regular basis that still don't know my real name, but I still talk to them on a daily basis. Like,
I don't even know where that username came from, actually. I just associate it with you.
Yes. And it's just one of those things. It's like, that is your identity. And it's like one of the ideas. It's like he changed his name from like, was it like Awesome Wade to Parzival, and then using like gamer lingo because Parzival, which is the person that found the Holy Grail, he had to change it to a Z. Same as with like Artemis.
That's a reference. Yeah. There's a lot of, not just pop culture references, but like literary references too. Like Parzival is a Holy Grail reference. Makes sense because they're hunting for the Holy Grail. Like it's a similar idea. And then Artemis is, as we know from Percy Jackson, goddess of the hunt, and they're egg hunters or gunters as they get called.
Yeah, they're gunters. When it comes to like Wade Watts, is that I love the idea that his name is like an alliteration because his dad thought that's what a superhero would sound like
because he loves
superheroes. Yeah. So we gave him,
and then his dad died looting a TV or whatever.
Yeah. Like again, sad sack boy. It's like Willy Wonka, but like more depressing.
Oh yeah, he's not just poor. He's not just Charlie Bucket. He's like Charlie Bucket plus Harry Potter plus like a creepy neckbeard. Like there's a lot happening with this character.
In my headcanon, they should have just gotten Gene Wilder and like, oh no, Wade, you should like go out and take like a shower, you weird person.
Yeah. Yeah, Gene Wilder like appears in the clouds like Mufasa, like, wash your ass.
But yeah, no, like when it comes to the competition, like I love the ending parts where it's like they have like this huge battle and he's like the most competent person in this battle. And he comes up with the idea, they go through the gauntlet and the first one's impossible, but then it's like, if he didn't have his friends with him, he wouldn't have been able to defeat Tempest. But then when he got to the other ones, like, that's where he got it. And I love that about that is because, like, it's the Holy Grail. And then the thing that makes me, like, almost, like, tear up is, like, the last Easter egg is the first Easter egg ever.
Mm-hmm. It's like a reference to the concept of Easter eggs.
Pretty much like the end of Wade's character arc is, it's like a sports movie. He gets the girl in the end.
Well, does he, though?
I want to say yes, because Ernest Cline's a weirdo and, everyone needs a happy ending. Because even in, like, creepy 80s movies, like 16 Candles, the really creepy guy, like, gets the girl in the end. So, like...
Well, except for, Ducky. He doesn't get the girl.
Ducky no, that's the part that pisses me off, because I love Ducky and Pretty in Pink. What did you think about Artemis?
I like Artemis. I think she feels more sane to me. I don't know. She feels a little bit more grounded in reality.
Is that because she's Canadian?
Maybe. No, I feel like her goals for the Oasis are, like, altruistic, and she cares about, like, taking control of the Oasis for, like, a selfless reason, and I appreciate that about her.
When it comes to, like, Wade Watts, his first idea is like, you know what? I'm going to build a spaceship and I'm going to shoot myself into space.
And I'm shoot myself into space and then just, like, live like that and play video games or whatever he wants to do. Like, that's literally how he wants to live his life. And that's such a weird, selfish thing and totally speaks to his character. Like, he's very all about himself and about just fulfilling his needs and doesn't really think outside of himself. Literally doesn't think about the outside world at all, really.
Yes, that's the one thing I like to describe about Artemis is that the best way to put her, she's like a manic pixie almost, and how she's like this almost like a mythical creature that just wants to do good in the world, except the way she has to do good in the world is to be like going through the threshold of like
is to be away from the world.
To be away from the world. And then you have like the teenager aspect of, oh no, I have a birthmark. That means I'm hideous.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, what is this? Like Grand Budapest Hotel, you just have a birthmark. She looks like almost the same as her avatar, right? That's the whole thing at the end.
Yes.
She looks exactly the same as she has a birthmark. And then he's still like, oh, you're beautiful. Yeah, because you just, like, are a weirdo who has never been with any girls because you weird people out. Like, that's, like, come on, Wade. Like, of course. He would like her. He's obsessed with her. He's, like, a stalker, basically. She's also kind of an online celebrity, right, before they even meet. Like, she writes all these blog posts about 80s pop culture. So it's like this parasocial relationship that people sometimes have with like online content creators that he has with this person that he starts to get to know, maybe not in person, but sort of more one-on-one, I guess.
Well, it's the idea of like you like a content creator so much that it's like, I really either want to be with you or I want to learn everything I can about you.
Yeah, or like this misconception, like, oh, I know you. I know you because I know your online persona and I know these very specific things about you and the content that you create or whatever. And that's obviously like a dangerous mindset to be in.
Well, yes, and the one thing I love about Artemis as well is that she's very like calculating because when she's like unhinged, like when they first meet and she's like just rambling, and then when they start to do like the I am text, it's like, I prefer this because I actually can think about what I'm going to say before like I shove my foot in my mouth. And I love that about her.
Which is something that maybe Wade doesn't think too much about, is shoving his foot in his mouth. He just says things.
Wade puts 2 feet in his mouth, and he's just like, oh, okay.
He doesn't have, like, boundaries, I feel like, because he just, like, immediately when he meets Artemis is very clingy and weird, and, like, it creeps me out.
The most important thing, like, when I'm looking at this and I'm looking at Ernest Cline or, like, writing female characters is that they have more of the spotlight, and they're not just, like, when you think of like a video game, you think of like big boobs, skimpy armor, and the way he always describes Artemis is not at all like, oh, like she just wears armor and she like totes like Ray-Bans and like Chucks. I guess what's the best word to put this? I guess like warrior goddess.
Well, I mean, but also that's still like a stereotype
Yes.
though. She's like manic pixie dream girl. Like she's not like other girls. She's like one of the boys because she likes your specific nerdy thing, which is again a very specific like nerd culture fantasy of like the hot girl who also likes nerd stuff. But that's definitely like the stereotype that she inhabits is like manic pixie dream girl, nerd girl, like I'm getting a lot of what's like Scott Pilgrim kind of vibes.
Yeah, she has a lot of like Ramona Flowers vibe to her, but I think the difference though is that's her online persona, whereas like her actual persona as a person is completely different.
Well, she's also, yeah, because she's like insecure about her birthmark, which is, again, another thing of like perfectly aesthetic person who just happens to have a birthmark that like no one would be weird about, but they just, it's to add, I guess, depth to her character other than, she's just like literally exactly the same. Or a dude named Chuck, as Wade is constantly worried about that it's a bald dude named Chuck.
Well, I mean, that's like an actual thing because this is like, we are in the age of catfishing.
Yeah, exactly. He's afraid of like virtual catfishing, which we'll get to with H.
Oh, yes. I'm excited to talk about H. But when it comes to Artemis, what I really, enjoy about her again is like out of all of them, she is the most grounded. And I find she also has some of the best like moments in the book. Wade has like all like the spectacle, whereas like Artemis has the moments where like, she does all these things. And she's technically the first person to figure out the Easter egg.
She realizes things too, because she also knows about pop culture. Like he's not the only one who's obsessed. He's more obsessed because that's his personality in some ways. Like no one can be as obsessed as him, but she's still very smart, I think, is how she comes across.
So the difference between Wade Watts and Samantha is that Wade thinks it's a game, whereas Artemis doesn't, and she's like, we need to win this for the specific reason.
For the fate of humanity.
And that's what I love about it, and now we're going to probably get into the next character, which actually is going to be H, who I love. What do you think about HB?
H is really interesting. So when we go to Wade's school, there's he says something like the teacher could be like what was it, like an Inuit woman, but presents themselves as like a dude because that's like more acceptable. Like, oh, you can gain the social capital of like a straight white dude in the Oasis, even if you're not. And that's the case with H, because H is presumed to be a buff white guy because that's what her avatar is. But then finally they meet at the end and realize H stands for Helen Harris and that she's a lady, a black woman, and also gay. So there's a lot going on there. I don't know. You'd think at first that it's like this big plot twist, like, oh my God, like you're a different sex than you said you were, which is kind of like the whole time Parsifal's like worrying about Artemis because that's like his love interest. Like, oh no, what if it's a hairy dude named Chuck? It doesn't even occur to him that someone would do the opposite. Yeah, it does make sense that you would present as like a white dude because you would be treated differently if you weren't. And like that, there's a certain freedom there. And then again, less judgmental of the people in this world that inhabit the Oasis all the time. Like you can be anyone. You don't have to conform. I mean, in some ways you do have to conform, but you don't have to be like dealt the hand that you were dealt and be treated a certain way based on homophobia and sexism and racism, and instead you could like look the way that people will give you the most respect.
Even with H, like she can be all these things, but in the end, like her mom still hates her for being gay. And it's like, well, I'm still rich and powerful, but my mom hates me.
Yeah, it's a sad thing. I mean, everyone has a tragic backstory in this. Wade's parents are dead. Artemis's parents are dead. I mean, even Artemis is like, oh, well, other people have it worse. Like, it's a horrible universe to live in. Like, either the people around you are wrapped up in their own horrible life choices, I guess, just living in this ravaged earth, or you probably don't have anybody.
So the way I'm looking at this is like normally the people who have the most time on their hands are people that don't have family, or they have to either be dead to go on this quest.
Yeah, that's
and specifically,
true.
If you're going to be gunting, you need to have as much time as possible. So you either have to be pretty much like Wade's case of just like a shut-in, or you need to be like, hey, you need to have a purpose, or you need to be like H, whereas like I'm just mobile because that's the only way I can live is like a very like nomadic life.
Because she's like estranged from her family and she has nothing else to do.
Even if we look at Shoto and Daito, I have a hard time saying this, the hikikomori, which is an actual phenomenon in Japan where people are just so obsessed with the internet. And the difference though is like with Shoto and Daito is like they consider themselves brothers, but they'll never meet face to face.
They're not actually brothers, right? We find out that they're just like emotionally brothers. Like I like that because you see that there are different types of emotional connections that could happen. Like there's almost like a familial bond there with H, and with Parsifal it's like a really strong friendship bond. And then Artemis and Parsifal, like he thinks he's in love with her. I think that it's sort of a one-sided weird thing, and I don't know if it's hard to say that that's love or if that's like infatuation or something like that.
And the funny thing is there's a parallel between Wade Watts and James Halliday, where James Halliday did the exact same thing as Wade did, which was, he was super infatuated with a girl, and, he didn't actually show her feelings to him, and, his friend, got Kira, and then she died. He became such a shut-in that he eventually just died. There's actually, a weird parallel between them, but the one thing I really enjoy about James Halliday is that he just loves people playing his game. That's all he ever wanted in his life, was people to appreciate what he did and what he loved, and that even though he has Asperger's, he understands. He has enough ideas. It's oh, I'm good at one thing and I don't really need to deal with people. But then he accidentally created the biggest beast in the world.
I mean, it's like a gift and a curse, the Oasis, right? Because it gives people an escape in a horrible place, but maybe it gives them less of an incentive to make the real world better. It provides all these resources for a very low price. It costs a quarter to get in. You get upcharged for all of the transactional stuff, which makes sense. That's kind of the way that online things work. The school system is in the Oasis, or at least the school system everyone goes to. I don't know if there's an outside one. I'm pretty sure everyone just goes to.
Oh yeah, no, there is, because remember he talks about how awful it is.
Oh right, yeah, he does. Oh yeah, he briefly mentions that there is a public or whatever non-Oasis school that's terrible.
So here's the thing: do you think it's in the stacks? Do you think it's on the top? It's just a school building, or do you think it's a super mobile?
Yeah, just precarious. It's probably an old bombed out shelter, some repurposed building that is a school, I would imagine.
So I'm thinking of Invader Zim, where they have the school, but the school is spelled Skool.
Yeah, they don't know how to spell. Yeah, that's kind of what I imagined. But yeah, there's a lot of good things about the Oasis. In some ways, it's a powerful tool, I guess, and can be used in a lot of different ways. That's why IOI wants it, really, because they could use it to just be controlled by their corporation and charge people a bunch of money to just exist in it.
Yes, and whereas James Halliday is I literally coded this game to you literally start off by saying Ready Player One to harken back to simpler times. Even when we get to Wade, when he's at his lowest, where he's playing the perfect game of Pac-Man, he finds the one Easter egg that was so not even supposed. Well, I mean, it was an Easter egg, but it wasn't the Easter egg. It's just something that he coded in, just to have fun, and it was an extra life, the biggest thing you could possibly have in the Oasis,
which ends up being very Deus Ex Machina at the end,
which actually works because you forget about it.
Yeah, because he's oh gee, thanks for this coin that is useless.
It's one of those things where it's I like James Halliday, especially at the end when he's telling him, it's oh yeah, so you see that button over there that just materializes? Yeah, if you push that, it kills the entire game for everybody. I actually made a fail-safe just in case.
That might come into play in the next book, I feel like.
I mean, if it doesn't, I'd be really confused because it's a Chekhov's gun almost.
It's a big red button, literally. I mean, come on. You put a big red button, someone's going to press the big red button. Maybe not now, but eventually. Yeah, I'm thinking about that, and also, can you imagine for a second, right? The Oasis is a complicated place. A lot of people use it for bad things. A lot of people use it to escape a world that they should be helping. But if it exploded, if it was gone, no more points, no more anything, everyone lost all of their virtual belongings, and they just existed in reality. All at once, all these people who were shut-ins, who were completely removed from the real world. Can you imagine the nightmare that would happen? The rioting in the streets.
So what would end up happening is the idea of in the 1930s where people were just jumping off of buildings because they lost all their money in the stock market.
Yeah, because all belongings exist in the Oasis now, because it's that's where everyone has their currency, their life, their everything.
So it's going to be exactly like the ending of Fight Club. They have the gigantic skyscraper explosion with Project Mayhem.
Right, and they destroy everyone's debt.
So the second the Oasis goes offline, people will start eating each other and jumping off of buildings, and it would become Mad Max.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel a lot of sci-fi makes it so technology doesn't connect people. People are in almost nomadic groups, but that's the reverse here, where you're so hyper connected, but you're not actually engaging with any of the real world stuff. They haven't reached the point in post-apocalyptic world building where there's no technology and they have to revert back to the simpler times of just starting fires and surviving and living nomadically and stuff.
B, there is a vending machine in this book that gives you a gun.
Yeah, there's a vending machine that has a gun. You're right. I forgot about the gun vending machines. There's a lot going on in these books. In this book, I have to say.
I'm like thinking of like Titanic now, like the guys like don't move an inch, even though they would be using the metric system because they're all Europeans.
Mhm.
He just starts shooting people trying to get to the lifeboats.
It would be really bad with I mean, I guess the world is already terrible and people are getting shot at because of looters and like they're going into their vending machines that have guns. That's so sad and too true that I don't even want to think about it too much. Yikes.
But it's like one of those things where it's like James Halliday made a game because he was really proud of himself and, you know, became this big beast. And then it's like at the end of his life, he even even with Ernest Cline and like with James Halliday, like even in the movie, they did this where it's the last line he says before the end is like, it's one of my favorite Groucho Marx lines. It's, I'm not crazy about reality, but it's still the only place where you can get a decent meal.
Yeah. And James Halliday says a very similar thing, which is that reality is the only place where you can be happy. Even though that the world is terrible, real happiness can only come from a real place. Because otherwise, your happiness is just artificial as the Oasis is.
When it comes to the story, because I think it's time for us to get to the story, because, you know, we've talked about all the characters, is that I think the moral of the story is kind of like, you can be plugged into technology because technology is a great thing because, you know, it helps us with everything, but just don't like invest your entire life into it because you're just going to waste away achieving nothing. Poof.
There's a lot of metaphysical thought experiments going on in this book because you start to think about like, well, what is existence? And like, if the Oasis feels real, is it real? And
yes, and that's kind of like the idea of it's like, so I guess the story of the book, I mean, we're about an hour in. Story of the book, creator dies, makes this Easter egg that's like, oh, if you get this Easter egg, you'll win all my money, which is trillions of dollars, and you'll actually own the Oasis.
yeah, because the description of from USA Today of this book is enchanting Willy Wonka meets the Matrix, which just sums it up really, because you're living it's the Matrix because of the virtual reality thing, and Willy Wonka because James Halliday is like this weird recluse figure that no one really knows about who has a contest, and if you win the contest, you get it all. You don't just get a tour of his chocolate factory.
No one ever goes in.
No
one ever goes out.
Exactly. It's the same idea. In this case, I guess in Willy Wonka, Charlie Bucket doesn't know that he's going to get the factory. He just thinks he's going to get like to see the factory, and then at the end, he's like,
the prize would be a lifetime supply of chocolate. You monster, you fiend, you crook. How could you do that to a little boy?
yeah.
Take all of his dreams and smush them.
So in this case, that you just win the Oasis. You win
the game of life.
Well, basically, because that's the world that people live in, basically. Like, they don't live in reality.
So pretty much what you win is you get to become a god, like a physical god.
Well, not a physical. I mean, literally a virtual god, because you're virtual. But all the power that you could want, because all the power that matters is in the Oasis.
And so the only way to like win it is you have to complete like riddles, and you get keys that open gates. And I think we'll just talk about the keys and the gates and what they do, because that's really the main crux of the story, other than just like finding yourself and being who you are. What did you think of all the challenges, B?
Yeah, I mean, like, these are the excuses to talk about the references, right? So that yeah. So,
So B, what did you think of the challenges?
The challenges were interesting. I didn't, like, understand a lot of them, though. Like, for instance, I didn't know the movie War Games, so when he unlocks the first gate, I get that it was a reference, but, like, that, I wasn't like, wow, War Games!
Well, there's a specific reason why they're all changed in the context of the movie, because instead of War Games, because imagine watching War Games, but being a part of it, because that idea of, like, you get to be the main character and you get to say all the lines and stuff is a cool idea, but it would be really boring to see in a movie. Instead, it's a race. Second one is they go into The Shining, which is presumably a much more famous movie than War Games. Like, no one knows about War Games but me and, like, a bunch of 50 to 60-year-olds.
Nerds. Yeah, I found this happen to me a lot, that I bet if you know most of these references, this book is really fun because you're like, wow, that reference to that game that I like, or that reference to that movie that I like. But I did that sometimes, but I found myself a lot of times feeling almost alienated from not understanding what's going on, or not like getting that it's a reference but being like, I don't really care about this reference because I don't have any context from it. I didn't know about it before.
I guess the way that Ernest Cline, because he's not an idiot, how he did this was every time there was like a reference, he'd have to explain it in nauseating detail. Like, did you know about like War Games? It's a movie from the 80s starring Matthew Broderick. Like, it is such a good movie. Like, it was from the 80s.
Yeah, and then you understand. But then, exactly, because I guess the choice you're given is either explain it within an inch of your life, because you can't expect everyone to know what War Games is, because I had never even heard of it, I don't think, before I read this book. And I'm, like, fairly well-versed in pop culture. Like, I know some things. I don't just know about the things from when I was alive.
War Games is actually a really fun movie, not gonna lie. But it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, to an average person, it wouldn't make sense. But I feel like this is the thing I was thinking about yesterday before we decided we're going to record today, is this book is going to benefit with age, because the second we distance ourselves from the 80s and this book becomes like, what the heck is War Games? The book will get a whole new meaning. It's like, oh my god.
Yeah, but I don't know if people will like it more or less. But again, like I said, it's either you have to explain it because you can't trust that people will know, or you don't explain it. And not all of the references, some of the smaller references are just like vaguely mentioned, and then they don't go into super detail. And that I'm like, oh wait, what is that again? And then I have to like double check to like, there's a lot of Googling.
Oh yes, and then there's even like references. It's like his password is what they say in the movie The Last Starfighter, that no one's seen that movie. But it's like the idea of like the challenges, which, you know, some of them are great, such as like the first challenge is the Tomb of Horrors, where you have to go through a D&D campaign,
Mm-hmm.
which...
It's a reference of a D&D map, which is kind of fun. I got that. Obviously, I've played D&D before. I don't know specifically the Tomb of Horrors. Like, I wasn't like that much into the nitty-gritty of the origins of what the Tomb of Horrors was, but I got the idea. I got the gist. Like, it's sort of like reading this book is like when you watch a show that's like using a pastiche or referencing a movie you've never seen, but that movie's been referenced so many times that you're like, I kind of know what this is. I get like the cultural idea of what this is. And that's like most of my experience reading.
But that's kind of like the brilliance kind of this book, is like you take things like references that would be considered like super famous, like, no, I am your father, or like Star Wars stuff. And the funny thing is like, it makes sense in the context of the book, because you have to be like a super fan of the 80s to understand the references.
Right. Because if it was like a superficial reference, then it wouldn't make sense for it to be a special talent that Wade has to know all these things. Or for that matter, for Halliday. Like, the exceptional thing about Halliday is that he knows all these niche things, these things that not everyone would know or not everyone would remember. And so if they were just like, oh yeah, like Star Wars or whatever, which sometimes they do reference like bigger things, obviously, but you need to have those niche things for it to be a contest, or else you just be like, okay, well, I know these things.
I mean, that's a perfect example is the second challenge with the Captain Crunch, the hacker guy. It's like you have to blow a whistle. No one would know that, but like 3 people.
Right. Oh yeah, he hacked the he like played the whistle and hacked the computer system.
I mean, even like with like Zork, like no one's gonna get it. Even like I knew about it, but that was because like it's just one of those weird things that I just know. But like even like I had to like look it up. Like some of them are like a hit and miss. Same as like when we get into Rush. Oh dear God, do I not know a thing about Rush?
No, I don't know a thing about Rush either. Yeah, the music stuff, sometimes it's funny because sometimes I know about older music, but Rush is definitely not a genre because it's too old for me to really be into it, but it's too young for my parents to be into it.
The funny thing is, like, Rush is considered one of the greatest bands of all time. Like, they've won so many awards and best-selling albums. But, like, no one, I mean, I guess unless, like, you're, like, Ernest Cline age, like, you wouldn't know who they are.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of them. I've heard maybe a song or two by them. I knew, like, people who were, like, in my high school rock club who were really into Rush, but I was not into Rush.
There's, like, a couple songs. The song that people remember is Tom Sawyer.
Oh yeah. Okay, I know.
Then we get like the more Easter eggs of like the origami from Blade Runner. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I like that. Then you go into the video game, Black Tiger, and you play it that way. And then the last one is a Schoolhouse Rock reference where you need to have 3 as a magic number.
I guess that's very. I thought Schoolhouse Rock came out in the 70s, but I guess they were in the 80s too.
Doesn't mean it has to be in the 80s. James Halliday grew up, was a teenager. My favorite thing about that reference is that with IOY, like they're trying to figure it out, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's a Bible reference," or it's like something. It's like instead of it being so obvious of being like a Schoolhouse Rock reference.
Yeah, they take it so seriously, and they're like, "Wait, 3 is a magic number." Yes, it is.
Yes, and that's how it's like. What James Halliday really wanted at the end was a competition, because it's modeled after Sword Quest, which they talk about in this book about Atari had a game competition where they made like cartridges with hidden challenges in them, and if you could get all the clues and stuff, you would send it into Atari, and then you would go into another competition where you'd have to solve more clues, and then you would win like a scepter, a crown, a philosopher's stone. They only did about 3 of them until like the video game Crash.
That's pretty
Oh
cool,
no, it's
though.
amazing. If you want a really good in-depth version of that, you can watch the Angry Video Game Nerds version of Sword Quest, and it's a really great video about it.
Yeah, I feel like that. I mean, that's also harkening back to, I guess, in the 80s in general, the idea of having like contests where you could win physical prizes. Also, it makes sense why it's like self-referential in a
Like
way.
one of my favorite things that's not in this book is that, do you know there's like I can't remember the name of the fantasy book series, but there was an author who's like, I'm gonna hide clues in my book, and if you can find them all and go to the spot on the map, I have literally buried treasure, and no one has found that treasure yet.
Oh man, but people know about it.
Yeah, it was like a marketing thing for the book series, and no one has found it. Like that's like a story waiting to happen. Like I'd love to like learn where that treasure is.
I'd love a documentary about that. That would be really cool.
So going back to it, we get into the competition, and the whole time is after everyone's been like obliterated after this gigantic like monster battle with like literally like
Yeah,
giant
Mechagodzilla.
Godzilla. Yes, I was so excited.
Yeah.
The best way to put it is I think the movie does justice to it more of how insane it is, because it's like every reference just blows its load right on the screen.
This book is very much like an Ouroboros of pop culture, where it's like a snake eating its own tail. Like having a giant epic battle at the end of something is very 80s. Like it's not just, I don't know. It like the story beats are like replicating what an 80s story would be like.
Well, you'd have like the big battle, especially like in a fantasy book. You'd always have the last battle before the goal. In the Two Towers, you have the Battle of Helm's Deep. The third one, you have the battle all in Mordor. And well, you have like the little quest, which I guess, yeah, it's kind of like modeled after Lord of the Rings a little bit, where you have like this big battle, but then Wade Watts has to do his little adventure. He has to go through the whole competition before the Sixers does, which is when you're reading it, sounds very stressful because it's like, oh my god, what if they catch up? But, once they get to the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, like, he's just happy.
He just gets the references inherently while they're just like using their like giant.
They're cheating.
Yeah, I mean they're literally cheating. There are no rules technically, but they're using a team of researchers to try and figure out something that this one guy just knows inherently.
Again, it's like the idea of like an 80s movie. It's like the nerds versus the jocks, and like the jocks have like a radio on them. Yeah. And it's like you just have like a bunch of dumb meatheads that are like, they get smarter people, like the nerds, to help them. Whereas Wade Watts is just, he's so good at what he does. He's so good at being like a pop culture loser junkie that it benefits him. And then you have the idea of it's like he's in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is the only challenge I might actually be able to like win.
You know what? I've never actually watched the entirety of Monty Python. Yeah, I know the references. Like, I know, like, the Just the Flesh Wound thing, and yeah. Like,
See, now when I come over again, but we're watching it.
I mean, I would watch it. I just, like, it's one of those, like, I don't know, like, grand canon of, like, movies that I feel like I'm supposed to watch, but I just, like, haven't watched it, and I feel bad about it. Anyway. I'm aware of it.
But then we get to the final challenge, which is he's left in a room and he has to figure out what's next. And, he pieces things together and realizes, oh my god, I have to play the game Adventure, which has the first Easter egg ever really on it.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is in the movie, too, where IOI thinks that the point is you're supposed to beat the game, but what you're really supposed to do is to play the game and to wander around, and in that case, you find the Easter egg. So it's like this, it's the true test if you're a real fan, because it's not like just doing the thing that you think you're supposed to do. It's about, like, actually enjoying yourself.
It's a lot like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where, you have to choose wisely with the cups or you become a spooky Nazi skeleton.
And they're all, like, picking, like, the fanciest cups, and then he's like, no, it's the very plain one, and that's the one.
The whole point of the Easter egg is to play for the Easter egg, which I think as a gamer, it's like one of the best things to have in there, because it's like most games you don't really beat. You like to have fun and play.
I haven't beat most of the games that I own. I just play them mainly, which is maybe not the best thing to do when you've had them for a long time.
Well, it's like the joke. It's like there's two types of gamers. There's the casuals and then there's the sweaties. I'm
like very not into completionism. I'm just sort of like, oh, I'm going to wander around and do this for a while. And that's probably why I like to play open world games, because I'm just like, I'm just going to mess around with this for a long time. Because that's the purpose of a game, really, is to have fun and to not necessarily beat it.
But that's like the great thing about the story is, obviously Wade gets the Easter egg. He uses it for, hopefully he uses it for good. But that's what I like about this is, when we have like the insane amount of pop culture references, like again, it's like almost like being punch drunk.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's so many. Have you looked at the list?
The list is up in my head, B.
Yeah, like I looked up a list and it's so many things, Zach.
So B, I need to ask you a question. While you were reading this, it was like, oh, this is like Zach talking to me.
Oh, I mean, like, you totally warned me about this, that it would remind me of you, but it does. Because it's pop culture stuff and it's literary stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's definitely your wheelhouse. God, Ready Player One really is like the dude's version of Gilmore Girls, because it's the same thing. It's just different pop culture. There's some overlap, I think.
I mean, I just watched The Marvelous Miss Maisel, and I can actually attest to that.
Right? Because it's the same thing. Amy Sherman Palladino is obsessed with pop culture references, and I've always related to that. The only reason that this Ready Player One doesn't feel like it's made for me necessarily is because I consume different pop culture. I consume some of this pop culture, but not all of it.
Well, see, that's why I think like this book is going to benefit when it's so far in the head in the future, when it's actually 2044 and people are actually reading it, because people are still so used to like the 80s culture. It's like, okay. But like when you take it out and like you're in this weird like almost like how Halliday's thinking about it, it's like this weird like niche period of time, which is the 1980s, when it's 2044, that's like 60 years. Why would the person like want to learn stuff from the 80s rather than like what the pop culture is of that day? Like I think that's one of the benefits is this book, even though I don't think some of the content will age quite well, I think like the bulk of the themes and stuff, and also the idea of the pop culture will age really well with this book.
Well, I mean, we're already nostalgic about the 80s because there are things like Stranger Things and stuff. Like, it's been long enough that people are really nostalgic for the 80s. That's why this book exists.
This book exists because Ernest Cline likes talking about this stuff, so he wrote it.
Oh, yeah, but I'm saying that's why this book is as popular as it is, because people are definitely into those references.
Well, yes, and I think when it comes to, like, I'm saying, like, 60 years from now, I think this book will also benefit by being so disattached from the 80s, because most of those people will be in their 60s to 70s.
Yeah, then people will just be, like, seeing the 80s as, like, such a bygone era that it, like, the way that I would talk about, like, the 30s or something.
Yes, exactly. Which, just imagine this book, but it's, like, set in the 1930s. All the references are the 1930s.
Did you see a talkie? Yeah.
What are you talking about, babe? Didn't you put on the new Andrews Sisters album?
Okay, we're joking about that, but that's literally Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is just like taking all those references and then like scooting it back a little bit. Like, yeah, they just reference like they're like, oh yeah, the Dione triplets or whatever. Like all of that like different pop culture references are just from like the 50s and 60s instead, but it's the same thing. So like that definitely has been done before.
So what you're telling me is that Ernest Cline and what's her name?
Amy Sherman Palladino.
Yes, they should become a power couple and write the ultimate pop culture book.
She's already a power couple because Dan Palladino is like her co-writer and he like writes on her show sometimes. So yeah, she already is a power couple. But I would be fascinated to see how they would react to each other because they don't have everything in common, but I think they're around the same age.
I'm sure like if they ever met, I think I would love if they like collaborated and made one book.
And it would just be us. It would be you and me.
Wait a sec, B. Do you realize this is the parallel?
Yeah, we're just alternate versions of each other. Like, I'm kind of critical of this book for referencing all the time, but I love Gilmore Girls, and that is the same thing. It's the same, Zach.
Wrapping up a little bit, we're going to talk about the themes for a little bit, and then we'll probably 52 Skidoo out of here. I would say like one of the main themes is like for life to play the game rather than trying to beat life, almost. I think big thing as well is it's like the idea of like not to be super obsessed with something unless it's going to benefit you in some niche way.
There's a lot of themes to this. Identity, I guess, is one because, you know, there are people with usernames that they go by that are different than who they are in reality, and that's kind of an interesting concept. Like, there is some benefit to having an alter ego because it's like a separate world from them. I don't know. I have like mixed feelings about the Oasis, like we've talked about, because it's like a powerful tool that they can use for good, and there's schools and there's things that can be used to help, and Artemis wants to use it to help the world.
Well, I mean, like when it comes to any resource, you can either use it or you can abuse it.
Yeah, I feel that way as well. I'd be really interested to see if like they do press that button, you know, and it all goes away, and what
so
is
they're
gonna
push that Whopper button?
Yeah, and like what they would do to fix the world afterwards. Like, I don't know.
Oh, is this before or after like they decide like the crazy general that has now lost everything decides to turn all the keys and like shoot the nukes into the air?
Yeah, like obviously the world would be maybe more of a disaster than when they started, but
and I'm sure like once we like get it, I'm sure we're gonna read it. I know I'll probably buy it day one.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would be interested to know what happens, but I don't know if I would necessarily buy it. Because again, it's like, I found this book interesting, but I don't know if I like loved it, if that makes sense. Like, it's not something that I like necessarily enjoyed the way that I think it was intended to be enjoyed. Like, yeah.
Everyone has a different taste, same as like playing video games or the movies they like.
Yeah, exactly. Like, my taste is just different as far as like the types of books that I like. I don't generally like sci-fi. I don't generally like something that, I mean, maybe I get some of the references, but I don't have nostalgia attached to these references or like an obsession attached to them. So I don't think that gives me the same like warm, fuzzy feeling that the book is trying to give. And that probably has a lot to do with how I read it.
And I'm sure like a lot of it, like for me, like I'm looking at this as like warm and fuzzy, but I didn't grow up in that time period. And with people that grew up in that time period, I'm sure this book's a lot different.
You're like Wade in some ways because you have nostalgia for a time that you weren't around for, but you're like interested in it because that's like an interest to you. Well, I don't have like necessarily a specific interest in 80s pop culture. I have an interest in general pop culture. I know some of these things. I know about John Hughes stuff. I know about some video games. I obviously, you know, I get, I don't know, general things. You know, the Muppets, of course I'm going to know who the Muppets are. You know what I'm saying? Like, there are references that are more ubiquitous. Yeah, exactly. Or, like, I mean, all of the 80s movie things I generally knew. Like, not, like, the specific, I guess, like, Brat Pack teen movie stuff I knew about, like, Ferris Bueller and all of that. That didn't strike me as too confusing. But, again, like, a lot of that stuff I don't find myself immersed in necessarily. I'm not like immersed in 80s pop culture as a whole.
Yeah, no, for me it's just different because it's like I guess the best way to put it is I almost parallel Wade in so many ways, but not as terrible as a person. I mean, I'm not narcissistic, but like Oof.
Oh no, you're not at all like Wade personality wise, but just like as far as interest wise goes, like you have the same interest as Ernest Klein. Like he's nostalgic about it. This is what he grew up with. You're interested in it. He is the Halliday to your Wade.
I would totally become a Gunter. That's the sad thing. Like I feel like that would just be like something I would do.
I don't know if I would become a Gunter. I don't know if I would want to do that. It's hard to say.
Well, it's hard to say, but also I think the main point I think also with this book is the idea of like online relationships. It kind of like either as a friendship or like actually like a romantic relationship and like how affect. And by what I mean by that is kind of like, look at us. We finally met in person after a year. Actually, 2 years. Good solid 2 years. And yet we're still friends.
Yeah, it's true because I don't want to like downplay how important it can be to like make friends online, especially for instance if you don't have like the resources to make friends in other ways. Like, what would Wade be doing otherwise? Like, yeah, the Oasis is an escape, but what is he going to be friends with? Like the roving, like violent people in the stacks who just want to like. Even his own aunt is like stealing from him. Of course he wants to escape. He wants to meet like-minded people. I don't want to blame him for that necessarily.
I don't blame Wade at all, and I think he became a better person because of it. Because when you look at the first part of this book, it's terrible. It's like a slog to get through because we just talk about how Debbie Downer he is. And then once you get past
and
that...
you're like, oh, I get why you're so bummed out.
God is dead. I'm going to fly my spaceship. I hate everything. F you. But yeah, I think that's kind of the main things, but I guess I have one more point before we log off, B, and that is, what would be your ideal Oasis adventure? Because you can go to, like, they've already established you can go to any world and people have made things, like I think what we could do is Series of Unfortunate Events, like, escapade.
Oh yeah, for sure, I would, like, visit that place, but again, I don't ever want to live in most settings of books. I find them interesting, but I don't want to live in them. Like, I don't want to live in the world of Percy Jackson. I don't want to live in the world of Unfortunate Events. Like, those are kind of terrible worlds, actually, and they're kind of horrifying. I would just want to live in this world, but kinder. Like, which, you know?
No, but I'm talking about, like, in the Oasis, what adventure would you want to have? Like, if you go to any world.
That's the thing, is I'm thinking about, like, what kind of adventure I would go on. I wouldn't really want to go on, like, a quest. Like, that doesn't sound fun for me. That sounds incredibly stressful. I'm like kind of not super into that idea. I guess like, you know, I'd be interested in, yeah, like Unfortunate Events, other like media that I consume would be interesting to like be immersed in that world, but
So B, you're telling me you don't want to be in every episode of the Gilmore Girls?
okay, well like the Gilmore Girls is just Connecticut though. Like I live in New York. I can drive to Connecticut. I've been to towns that look almost exactly the same as Stars Hollow. I don't need to, like, go to Stars Hollow, which is actually, like, a backlot in L.A.
Oh, man, you're bursting everyone's bubble. I mean, for me...
You can see, like, the Hollywood Hills, like, in the background.
I never said anything's perfect, B. But I think if I had to pick a quest, maybe Percy Jackson. Maybe. I feel like that'd be a fun...
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty cool.
Or Goosebumps. Every Goosebumps book I'd love to be in.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, like, I've never thought of a place that, like, I'd love to, like, specifically escape to. I can't think of one.
Well, there's, like, other things you could do in the Oasis. Like, you can go to school. Like, you can go to, like, a bunch of, like, museums or, like...
Yeah, I mean, I could, like, see amazing things, see amazing sights, but, again, like, it's also fake, though. So that's, like, you don't get to be like, oh, I got to see the Grand Canyon. You'd be like, oh, I got, like, to see a facsimile of the Grand Canyon through the Oasis. Because it's probably filled with garbage in this universe also, because the world is a trash fire and it's covered in, you know, refuse.
B, that's too kind. It would be the sewers. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it would be bad.
It would be bad. Well, any last thoughts on the book, B? Should people read it?
Should people read it? I don't know. I think it depends on the kind of person you are. It depends on what media you consume. I think the way that I read it is the only way I would have read it. Is this in this context where I get to talk about like the implications of it socially and culturally, but as far as like for my own fun, I don't think I would have read it because it's just like it doesn't resonate with me like the way it maybe resonates with you or other people who actually like specifically care about the stuff it's talking about. I'm kind of like, I have mixed feelings about it. I also don't think it's necessarily like written in the best way. I don't think he's like a terrible writer, Ernest Cline, but he does sort of use the references as a crutch sometimes to describe things like, oh, it's like this, and you're like, okay, well, I don't know.
Yes, that
Yeah,
is a good point on it, especially when it comes to like this book. Like, there's parts I like about it. Like, the best way to describe it is this is a very trashy novel, but it's the type of trash like you could read this book on an airplane or a train, or you're going somewhere where you don't have to put much thought into it. Or it could be like one of those books like I'm bored and it's a rainy day, just want to read a book. I don't have to like really think about it all that much. And it's the perfect book. Otherwise, you're not going to get much like out of it unless like you're steeped in that culture. It ain't no Melville.
It's not very subtle, right? It kind of just spells out everything. Like, all the characterization is pretty obvious. They describe things, like, it's not even subtext. They tell you the kind of person that Wade is. They tell you the kind of person that Halliday is. There isn't really any kind of, like, reading into things you can do because it's all just there. And I don't think that that's, like, great writing.
That is the detriment to the book, because even me rereading the book, like, I could skip parts of it because I know what's going to happen next. The only reason why I would want to reread the book is kind of like to experience it again rather than like taking something new out of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Again, like, I don't think that it's like, if you like it, then you're an idiot, or that it's like so terrible that you need to like burn it in a fire or whatever. Like, people seem to be really dramatic about it especially when the movie came out.
Did you have any problems with it? Because I remember like reading like articles about, it's kind of like the idea of like trophyism.
Oh, you mean like the misogyny implications there? I mean, I've talked about that a little bit. Yeah, like the way that he treats Artemis makes me really uncomfortable, and I think that the narrative doesn't make that clear enough. Like, in the end, it basically is like the end of an 80s movie where it's like, oh, like she kisses him and everything's fine, but I wish that was interrogated just a little bit more beyond like the superficial, like, oh, like, what do you like IRL? Like, obviously you have to talk about that, but
in real life, people are more scummy, and like at least Wade has some. Surprisingly, for a creepy person, he has boundaries.
Well, lack of boundaries, but at a certain point, he has boundaries, and I don't think that that person necessarily exists, because most people like Wade probably are like very creepy and would take advantage of that situation and not understand that he's making someone uncomfortable by having this like parasocial understanding of them. Like, that's like my main complaint about it, that I don't think the book does enough to like admonish that kind of behavior. It does, it says, oh, like the real world is better, but the real world is him with this girl. Like, maybe he shouldn't get the girl. Maybe, he should understand her a little bit more as a person before he gets the girl.
Maybe, and maybe we'll find out in Ready Player 2, coming whenever that book is finished being written.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Zach.
I'm B.
And keep staying mortal. Now, if you need me, I'm going to go hop into my DeLorean and we're going to fly. If you know that old 80s movie with Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale.
Okay, yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.